Well, hi there, everyone. Welcome. This is Frances. I'm with Horizons International, and today we're going to focus on a look at our data from a decision-making point of view. We call it decision intelligence, with the subtext of going beyond cost and count. When it comes to decision intelligence, do you know where your data is? Sounds kind of like a canned or silly question, but the truth is, oftentimes we have to make decisions very quickly, and we need to know where the right data is to make those decisions. So we know that data is at the heart of all of our decision making. But the truth is, not all the data for our decision making in our businesses can be found in what I call our traditional cost and count business systems. So what do you think I mean when I say cost and count data? Well, some of those things are probably pretty obvious. We want to know what kind of quantities of items we have in inventory. If we're in the accounting department, we want to be able to look at the value on our GL accounts. What is the balance? When it comes to periodic reporting, a key asset we often want to report on is the inventory asset, which is a great example of cost. How much does each inventory item cost us? And count, because our asset is going to be a multiple of those two values. We're even going to look at things like sales by item or sales by account. These are all the traditional cost and count methods. So when we look at integrating manufacturing functionality, distribution functionality, quality control functionality, what do we get beyond basic cost and count data? So let's go take a look at our core manufacturing systems. When we look at the Dynamics GP user interface, what we see is the ability to look at our activity as transactions, as master records. We can do inquiries, and we have utilities that we run to help support keeping our data tidy and neat. But if we start out at the inventory card, what we're going to see is that pivot point where that cost and count information comes together. So on the item card, if I put in an item that I make, so I've got a drum of plastic flake that I create, what I'll see if I come down to the accounts is a relationship to the GL accounts that are going to be targeted to accept any dollar value transactions that are related to activities on the item. This is the core of the integration between a manufacturing solution and a solution that is based just on your financial data. Every time we run a traditional manufacturing task, which is relieving inventory, putting more inventory into our storeroom, we're going to have an equal effect on our GL. So this is our cost and count data. Another place we're going to see cost and count is if we look at something like a quantity inquiry form, where we can see our item number, we can see whether or not we have material on hand to support our customers, we can see whether or not we have additional materials due to be delivered as part of our production plan. Again, core cost and count data. And when we run through all of our transactions, some of the other areas where we start to move outside of core cost and count are going to be in things like lot tracing. So if we want to look up a lot trace based on a raw material, we're going to input our raw material number. We're going to select the lot number that we're most concerned about tracing. And we're going to want to take a look at how that lot of material has been consumed for as long as it's been in our inventory. So here we can see we have our raw material resin. This resin has been received on a specific receiver and purchase order. We've used some of this resin on a work order. And when we used it on a work order, we created an end item, which was our plastic flake. After that plastic flake was given a lot number, which happens to be the same as its work order number, that material was then used to build yet another end item, which was a drum of the plastic flake, where we took the flake and the drum and we put it all together. So this is still count data, but it's a bit more detailed than just how many. It's telling us how many, when, and where. Where else might we see data that we need to have to make decisions that is not just a part of cost and count, and that it can be driven through our quality system? Well, if we looked at a work order and we were going to fill up some more drums with our plastic flake, one of the things we might want to be able to do is determine which lots, if we had many in inventory, we wanted to use. So when I look at the plastic flake that I've already produced, what I can see is that I have some of those material left in my inventory attached to two distinct lot numbers. But over here on the right-hand side, I can see that I have information about the characteristics of the lot, what the intrinsic viscosity might be, what the melt point or the moisture is. These values are part of my quality control system. And that's one of the other places where I'm going to be looking at my decision intelligence data and looking for information that is beyond cost and count. So we took a quick look at some of the core cost and count activities that we're used to in a manufacturing and a financial distribution environment. So when do we need this data that goes beyond cost and count? Well, think for a moment. Has your organization ever had a need to select a new vendor for a new product that you're trying to build? How do you go about that process? What information do you use to help you evaluate who the right vendor is for that aspect of your business? Oh, perhaps you found out that there are environmental factors in your facility that can help you have a more consistent production output. Do you ever find you have to monitor those daily conditions so that you can make appropriate adjustments within the production process? How about simply understanding your rate of production flow? Do you know how to evaluate that rate of output? And what the factors are that affect whether or not the products you're producing are really conforming to the requirements that you need. Oftentimes, to help us with these kinds of decisions, we have to resort to spreadsheets or paper documents, which are very adequate to the task of collecting the data, but they can make it very difficult for us to make prompt decisions on that data because, first of all, we have to pull it all together from a variety of different sorts. So what I'd like to do today is introduce you to the concept of dashboards and data types that you can use to expand your decision intelligence and make better decisions for your business. So we're back in our manufacturing solution. And one of the things about our manufacturing solution is that it integrates tightly to our quality control solution. And in our quality control solution, when we open it up, what the user is presented with is a user-defined dashboard. Now, the data in this dashboard is going to be difficult or different than the data that you might find in your traditional business dashboard. And obtaining this data can be difficult if you don't have the right tools for collecting the data. In the top gauge of my dashboard, what I've done is I've given myself a visual representation of the inspection processes taking place in my facility. How many of them are sourced from purchasing? How many of them are sourced from production work orders or manufacturing orders or batch tickets? How many of them are not sourced in a business-related document at all? I can also see the status of the quality documents that I'm opening, generating, and closing over a time span. I'm really on time today because at this point, 92.5% of the documents that I opened as part of my quality control processes today have actually gone into history, meaning I've completed all the data required, and that data is now available for analysis. I do have a couple of documents that I voided, because what I found after I created them is I had made some kind of mistake in the creation, and that data is not any good to use for my analysis purposes. And I still have 5% of the documents that are still in my testing mode. That means they're in the hands of some individual in my facility who is responsible for an inspection or testing process. Another gauge that I find useful as the manager of the quality department is I want to understand, with regard to the data I am collecting, what kind of data types does it fall into? So this is just a few of the data types available in the core quality product. But we can have a system code, which is where we have a list of possible outcomes that can be selected. Although it's very clear from this diagram in the pie chart that in point of fact, almost half of the data that we collect for test results is in a numeric form. And of course, a numeric form is going to make it very easy for us to use that data in order to do additional analysis, particularly in the area of things like statistical process control. But how did I get this viewer created? How did I get access to this data? Because we all know this data is not part of my core cost and count data that's coming out of my business accounting system. In the quality solution, what we offer is we offer an integrated dashboard tool. And as part of this dashboard tool, when I open up the designer aspect of it, I can begin to build these various graphs and icons and charts to meet my particular needs. Let's look at some that I started and see what kind of additional manipulation we could do to them. So I'm going to open up an existing dashboard. And when it populates our form and we make it large enough that everybody can read the small print, What you'll see here is I've created 3 additional graphs based on looking at different slices of data that is being generated primarily from my quality control system. Well, let's take a look at the quality control system and see how that source data is fed to us in the first place. What we're going to do is we're going to open up something we call all-in-one results entry. This is a form that we use that allows us to record the results of our quality control processes. And let's not take that definition too seriously, because the quality control process is really a process that allows us to track any kind of data that's going to be relevant to our decision making. In this particular case, I have some of my resin material, and what we can tell is that this particular resin material was assigned lot number FR0153, and we can see that it was received on receiver 1172. This receiver is going to be linked to the vendor, which is going to be linked to the purchase order, and that's coming out of our core quality system, our core business system. When we inspected this resin as it was received from the vendor, we wanted to know a couple of key things about it. And those values do all happen to be numeric values, but we can have other types of values that we collect. So we wanted to know what the color was on a color scale. We wanted to know what the yellow value was, also on a scale. And we wanted to know what version of the formula did the vendor use when they created this resin for us, and we want to match it against our specific version of the formula. There's many different types of data points that we can collect in the quality control system. Let's take a look at a document that was created in order to evaluate our vendors. So first of all, we wanted to know who our vendor was. We also wanted to know how many years that vendor had been doing business with us. We want to know how many items in our inventory the vendor is responsible for supplying. And in point of fact, in the past year, how many receipts of those materials did we actually receive, and how many of them were considered to have come in on time. At that point, what we can evaluate is what the percent of acceptable material was that was received from the vendor, and we can assign the vendor a quality grade. And so as we move through these tasks, we're collecting an expanded amount of information that is relevant to the rest of our decision making. So let's take some of those data points back and look at the dashboard again. We'll come back to the dashboard viewer, and we'll open up the dashboard designer. And here were some simple starting points on our dashboard. Well, let's start with our first evaluation point, which is I need to pick a new vendor for a new resin material that I've been receiving. What I've done here is I've created a simple evaluation of, based on the data that I record when materials are received. You may recall I said, how on time is this vendor? Based on that information, I can tell out of the total deliveries from my vendor AAA, I have had 8 deliveries that were on time and 1 that was late. That's a pretty good ratio of on time to late. For my vendor AABB, I'm really doing a 50%. I've only had 2 deliveries. 1 was on time, 1 not on time. And then I have another vendor, but the product that vendor is responsible for delivery is not the same product as for my first 2 vendors. It turns out that the product that I'm looking to source in a new location is the product that comes from the first 2 vendors. Now, we can all probably figure out just by looking at the dashboard who the vendor is who should be selected. But let's go ahead and edit the filter and see if we can have the dashboard help us really refine that decision as part of our decision intelligence. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's add an item ID and say we only want to look at vendors that we're tracking for on-time delivery, where their product is a product that we currently get that's identical to or similar to the product we're about to start buying. So I can make that simple change as part of looking at my dashboard icon, and it's going to help me to see even more clearly that if I'm about to select a vendor that I want to start with, I should absolutely be selecting my AAA vendor in this particular circumstance. Now, there's additional information about this vendor that I could be looking at. And so if I have been keeping track of my vendor performance and I've created a supplier performance report, then I can come out into my reports I can look up my results entry, and I can select for my vendor the report that tells me what their performance has been. So here's my supplier performance report, and we'll just take a quick preview at that. On this supplier performance report, the last time I did a full evaluation of the AAA vendor, and they're due to have their evaluation done every 12 months. Their next requalification date will be March of 2016. And then I'm going to be able to look at the grades that I assign to them. And if I have this standard document completed for all of my vendors, then it's going to be very easy for me to run an evaluation between vendors on an overall basis and determine which would be the most suitable vendor for me to use for my next project. Going back to our dashboard, let's see what other adjustments we can make. In our second gauge, one of the things that we're doing is we're keeping track of the moisture level in our facility. And we're dating the collection of those moisture data points. So what we can see is we can see somewhat of a trend here, identifying that here in late June, our moisture level went down a little bit, but pretty much we can see where it's tracking, and we will have information that identifies whether or not that tracking level is within a zone that allows us to not make changes to our production methods, or whether we'll need to make some changes to our production methods. But it turns out we also want to know something else about that data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this graph with just a button click. So now I have a second copy of the same graph. But I have a different test that I want to track. So I'm going to open up my filter, and in this case I'm going to change the test ID. When I change that test ID and select OK, what we're going to see now is that I'm now tracking the heat temperature or the melt point of products that are being produced over the same time frame. We want to remember when we look at these kinds of graphs that in point of fact, our values on the left, on the vertical axis, represent the data that we are collecting, the data points, whereas the values on the horizontal axis represent the time or the document that we're tying that data point back to. It would be helpful, maybe, if we changed some of that labeling information, and we can do that pretty easily as well. So we'll come into the design area, and we can look at our y-axis settings. And when we look at that, we'll have an opportunity, for instance, to change and customize the text. So for this first item, our data value is really moisture percent in our facility. So we'll change that to custom text. And we'll see that that update took place absolutely immediately. We can also see that the specific test that we're tracking is being identified as part of the icon, so we can see it immediately without any additional work. Let's go to our duplicated graph, and we'll also change the label on the y-axis there. In this case, what we want to be aware of is that we're actually tracking degrees Fahrenheit. So that's just a few of the changes that we can make that will help make these individual decision intelligence graphs easier to use and easier to comprehend. My last graph is showing all of the tests that I've completed by number of instances of those tests. But it's not telling me which products I'm producing or receiving that I should be applying those tests, that I've been applying those tests against. So what we'll need to do is the same thing. We'll need to go in here and edit the filter. So what we'll do is we're going to say we really want to see for the items, and we'll use our AB resin, and let's see how many of these tests have been applied to the AB resin as we received it. We can see that quite a few of the tests are related to the AB resin item. And so again, we can change our labels and our titles of the graphs to tell us what the item is. Let's edit the filter further. Let's change this from AB resin to an item that we make, which is AB plastic flake. What we'll see here is that when it comes to testing in production, what we have is fewer tests with a fairly high degree of frequency that we're running those tests. Another part of the decision intelligence data that's relevant to collecting this data and using this data is to make this data available to our customers in a variety of different ways. One of the ways that we'll make it available to the customer is when we create an item specification report. So anytime we create definitions of our items, we can also go ahead and show those definitions, print them out on a document, and send those documents to our customers. So here we have an item specification report that identifies when we buy domestic tomatoes, what are the characteristics we're expecting? Well, first of all, we expect that we will see a country of origin of those domestic tomatoes as being the USA. We also have a carbohydrate percent that we expect those tomatoes to represent when we test them. And we also have a number of calendar days since pick that is the range during which we will allow ourselves to accept those items when they're sent to us. So where did all of this data come from? Well, this is part of the whole quality control testing process. And a way that we can see that very easily is if we use our master data tab and we look up our criteria for item inspections. In this process, every item that we make that has inspections attached to it, and if those inspections in turn have tests, we can look it up and we can examine what the performance requirements are for that particular item. So for the plastic flake that we make ourselves internally, we have a color test that we run with some degree of frequency. In that color inspection, we actually have 3 tests. We're checking for luminous, yellowness, and we're also checking to confirm that the version ID of the formula that's running in production matches the version ID of the formula that's the currently released version. We can have criteria, meaning standards that we want to achieve, and those standards can apply to that test anytime we take it, or they can apply specifically to an item. If I took a look at my AB resin item instead, what I would see is that in some cases, there are some very specific criteria that need to be met for those items, and there's a different series of inspection tests. And all of this data can be presented on reports and delivered to the end users. Part of what makes this whole process so effective for us, though, is because we do have an integration into the Dynamics GP environment that allows us to look at the relevant cost and count data as far as our quality control processes are concerned. And we're going to find that information in what we call the Operational Data tab. In this tab, we have a view of all of the items that are part of our Dynamics Great Plains inventory. We can tell whether or not the items are serial or lot controlled. We can even take a look at the items and see if they're at what the attached serial and lot numbers are that exist in our inventory system. And this data is being brought into the quality control system as a way of creating what's called a complete quality record. This way, anytime we have to report on quality data, even if we don't have access to our source enterprise system, or if for some reason we have very old data on the quality side and different things have happened with our enterprise data, we're still going to be able to access that complete quality record and report on it accurately. We can even see the customers we're doing business with, because we'll often need that customer information to show on a certificate of analysis. We can follow our receipts. This is how we knew what vendors were delivering us with product that was coming in on time or late. So that's a pretty brief overview of how the quality control system can combine with your core cost and count data in your enterprise business accounting package, so that you get a much fuller and broader picture of the functionality and the decision making that you need to make to run your business every day. I pretty much think that's a high-level, rather rushed overview. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or to contact the team at Bond with those questions, and we can certainly make arrangements for a more detailed and use-specific demonstration of the core functionality. Thank you so much for your attention.